So Ian, my question for you is this. What was the common understanding of human anatomy at the time that this letter was written? And when was this letter written? And what on earth does anatomy have to do with the guilt of humankind?
You don't know how to handle art. Anatomy correctly. That kind of helps me? Oh, there it is. I'm working on that part. I gotta hold the microphone, that's the hard part. The common understanding of reproductive anatomy, anyway, at the time, really of all the biblical writing, was that women were effectively the field where the seed was planted, right? Think Henry VIII thinking, what's wrong with all these wives who won't give him a son, not understanding the biology that he had everything to do with whether it was a boy or a girl, right? The biological understanding was not terribly complex. And so that actually contributes to what we've been talking about, what we talked about last week, or last time about the sense of women as property, right? And women had to be kept pure because that's where the seed was going to grow. And so you could tell lineage through women because you knew who your mother was, but you weren't always sure who planted the seed, right? So a lot of those codes, a lot of that rule making was about that kind of thing. So if that's how your social structure is created, right? The people who are going to take care of you are your family. That's the social net in the ancient world. And so you had to know who they were. And if there were any question, you had to establish that. So that led to a lot of the ways that men and women were treated differently. And in this letter, because you want me to go into that, right? The use, the whole language here in these verses has a lot to do with that understanding and exactly what that implies, and the whole social context. And the social context for this letter to the church in Rome is that Paul is really kind of at the height of his career at this point. He has been moving around the Mediterranean and mostly working with local congregations, gathering monies to give to the struggling church in Jerusalem. And it's interesting because most of these congregations were Gentiles who were coming to Christ, not Jews who were coming to Christ, which was a big controversy in the early church, right? Which plays into what he writes here in the letter to the Romans, which was probably written about 54 or 55, 58 maybe in the Common Era. So you have to remember these churches had letters and stories about Jesus. Maybe one of the Gospels, maybe not. The written Gospels, Mark's was the earliest one. Not quite sure. That might have been circulating this, but at 54. The Gospel of John was not even written yet. We're not so sure about Matthew and Luke, but it's not likely that they had any written Bible other than the Hebrew scrolls, the Torah and the law and the prophets. So keep that in mind, that's what's happening. And so this church in Rome is getting a letter from Paul saying, I'm coming your way, right? His idea was he was going to take that offering to the church in Jerusalem, and then he was going to head to Spain and stop in Rome on the way. That's the context of all of this. And this is really, in some ways, I think some would argue this is sort of Paul's magnum opus. He's really laying out his theology here, and he starts by really giving it to the Gentiles, right? That's what we just read in this first chapter. If you keep reading, you'll find in the next chapter, he really gives it to the Jews. Okay, so we remember that it's really easy to say, oh, those Gentiles and their sexual practice, oh my, they're terrible. Well, he's just pointing out that there were a lot of practices, and he's actually laying out in a very structured way in this first chapter that there's an exchange of something, and then God gives them up to something. You'll see that if you take a careful look at the structure of this first chapter. He starts by saying that these Gentiles exchanged the glory of God for idols, right? They worshiped the creature instead of the creator. And so and he says, they exchanged the glory of God, and so God gave them up to their corrupted hearts and degraded bodies. And that's verses 22 and 24. And then they exchanged the truth of God for a lie by worshiping their idols rather than the eternal God. So God gave them up to their degraded desires. And so you see the pattern here. And then he talks about that the females exchange their natural use, which is really the best translation of those words. And then he also says that the males do the same thing, and so God gives them up to their unfit mind to do what they ought not to do. So you see there's just a pattern. He's talking about how non-Jews, Jews have their own problems, we read about in the next couple chapters, but for the Gentiles, for the non-Jews, they were worshiping after the wrong things, and so God allowed them to do that. The punishment was, if you want to turn your back on me, I'll let you turn your back on me. That's really what Paul's saying here. So what's he saying about the sexuality of these folks? The term that gets translated in this translation as intercourse is the Greek word krasin, krasin is what it is here. It's in accusative form. But anyway, krasin is the word. It only appears 2 places in the New Testament, these 2 verses. Okay, so and when this word is used in Greek, it's about use. You use something. It's a function, use. So it's not about anything sexual except in this context. So that's why it gets translated as intercourse. And it's they give up their natural or normal. So it's natural, according to nature. So the use according to nature. So what's being said here? What's being said is that the women gave up the natural use of what or with how, right? It doesn't say in that verse. It's only in the next verse that Paul says that the men also, in like manner, gave up their natural use of women. Yes?
May I? So my question is this: if it's my nature to be attracted to men of my own gender, that's I mean, I know that my body responds, my heart responds, my stomach jumps into my heart, you know, when I see my husband.
Me?
Especially you. And only you.
Yeah, and yeah.
But I mean, that's a natural response of my body, right? So this natural thing, can it be argued that it's the nature of the individual unit, not the nature of the gender?
It's a great question.
As a class.
No, it's a great question, because this passage does talk about lusts and desires, right? It does talk about a desire and a burning and that kind of thing. So that's why
You didn't get a grade for that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, anointment will take care of it. But it's a tough crowd. No, that was last Sunday was Holy Humor Sunday. It's not today. Threw me off track. So that's why natural use gets translated as a sexual act. That's why we understand it as that. But when the early church fathers, I can name some of them because it's in my notes here, as soon as I find that place in my notes, Clement of Alexandria, Athanasius, and Augustine, they understood, quote, unnatural act as being non-coital sex. Right? So it was unnatural to not perform the act of reproduction.
And of course, that goes back to the Levitical codes, right?
Exactly, right.
Everything has a purpose and can only be used for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. And it also explains why the women giving up the natural use was not necessarily, like, I don't think we can draw the conclusion that Paul is talking about lesbianism here. There's no strong evidence that they were, because he doesn't say they were burning with desire for each other. The unnatural use is that they are not having men having sexual intercourse with them. Now, unnatural use could mean oral sex, anal sex, other forms of sex, you know.
Or daring to act as priests.
Yeah. But it's clearly a sexual context here. I don't think we can get away from the fact that Paul is using this as an example. It's one example of how Gentiles didn't do things the right way. Now, we can say, well, that's the word of God because Paul wrote it, and therefore we can extrapolate that it's therefore against God's will. I mean, you can say that. You can also say, this is a cultural understanding of Paul based on his understanding of biology and what is natural and what's not. It's the prevailing thought of his culture. Can we really expect him to think beyond that? You know? And he's not making a point here about a natural desire of one person for another. Also, the context, there's a lot of research that points to that most of homosexual practice, or at least between men, lesbianism very rarely gets even mentioned in antiquity, right? It's just not a concern. Again, it's not a concern because it's the men who are going to make little babies. The women don't have much to do with it except bearing them, right? So it's what the men do with the seed that matters in that context. It's just, it's where their thinking was. And so because of that, most of what we read about in terms of homosexual activities happens around different cultic activities. So temple prostitution was probably one of the primary places where homosexuality happened. Now, who knows culturally what was happening? Did people have side relationships that weren't actual marriages, but they lived together, and who knows? Or did men who felt desire for men take themselves to the temple to be prostitutes? So they had that. We don't know, right? I mean, because we aren't asking. No one was asking those questions of those people. But it's hard for us to say that Paul is actually saying, so don't do this. I don't see that as that. I see Paul as just assuming that you'll understand this unnatural thing. Now, not everything that's against nature is bad. If Paul believed that, then he'd have to say that circumcision is wrong. Because circumcision is clearly against nature, right? It's not how men are born. You have to be circumcised. So we can't say that just because he's saying that it was not natural to have sex in this way, that it was therefore also wrong. So the context really is that he's talking about how Gentiles did things that were different, and that God looked on that and said, let them go, they're wrong. And like I said, if you continue on, you'll find that in the next chapter, he talks about how much the Jews got it wrong, and then there's the verse in chapter 3 where he says, but we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So in the context of the book of Romans, he's just setting us up for saying, you'll find yourself in this list somewhere. This big long list of sins that he mentions, if one doesn't apply, keep reading, there'll be another one, right? And if you're not a Gentile and you say, oh, those bad Gentiles, just turn the page and you'll find out that you're included in this list too. So I don't think Paul is ever intending to make an argument against homosexuality here. He's just citing it with the assumption that you'll understand it's unnatural, and that's what happened with those Gentiles. So.
Ian? Because in that whole long list, it says unnatural as gossiping. And so all those people who gossip should be stoned to death as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Put it all into that context.
Paul's not making laws here.
No.
Paul's making a judgment about character, and his ultimate argument is we're all guilty, which is why we need Christ. I mean, that's the point he's going to make in the book of Romans. If we get sidetracked about this, we need to get sidetracked about everything on that list and say, where do we all fit in? So it's our reading of it that creates the problem. But I'm not going to whitewash it either. I do think that Paul is saying, yeah, homosexuality is unnatural, there's something wrong with it. But he also thought that women talking in church was wrong too. So there are cultural contexts to reading the scriptures.